The first ship came down at 6:14 in the morning, and Nell didn't move. She was lying on the porch boards, chin across my boot, watching the pasture the way she always did at that hour. Slow-eyed, patient, cataloging each standing post fence line the way a good working dog catalogs the things that belong. I had my coffee. The light was that flat gray that comes before the sun clears the eastern ridge, and the dew on the lower field was thick enough to show tracks. If anything had been through in the night, nothing had been through. That, when I came out at 5 to let the chickens out of the pen and the field was clean, so when the ship settled into the lower pasture, not crashed, not hard, just settled, the way you'd set a cast iron skillet on a trivet. I noted it the same way I'd have noted a deer standing in the alfalfa. Something was in the field. Get to it. Nell's ear flicked once. She put it back down. I finished the coffee. Poured a second cup from the thermos I keep on the rail. The ship was roughly the shape of a flattened seed pod, maybe 60 feet end to end, and it had settled between the second and third fence posts in the south pasture, which meant whoever was in it would have to deal with the electric fence wire, unless they came over by the gate. I had the gate padlocked. I wasn't planning to walk down and unlock it for anyone without a reason. The ship's side opened at 6:22. I counted 3 of them coming out. 2 in a gray that matched the hull, and 1 in a darker color that read like a uniform. They moved carefully, which I appreciated. Nothing spooking the cattle when there wasn't a need for it. The dark uniformed one held something in what passed for its hands, flat panel about the size of a clipboard, and it kept looking at it, and then looking at the farm, looking at me, looking back at the panel. Nell's tail lifted once, swept the boards twice, settled. The 3 of them made their way up along the fence line to the gate, as I'd figured, and stood there, looking at the padlock. The one with the panel said something in a language that didn't make it all the way to the porch, and then they spent about 30 seconds consulting the panel, and then the uniformed one looked up the slope at me and raised one of its appendages in a gesture that I interpreted, reasonably enough, as a request to open the gate. I set the coffee down, told Nell to stay, and went down. Head came up when I said stay. She watched me go. The moment I reached the bottom of the slope, she lowered it again and went back to watching the gesture. The one with the panel spoke first. Its name, as best I could render it in sounds I could actually produce, came out something like Vethavar, and it was the team's cultural liaison officer, which it explained to me in careful, effortful English that had the grammar right, but the cadence wrong. The way someone speaks when they learned the language from recordings. It told me that Earth had been under galactic survey for 14 of our months. It told me that the survey was in its final phase. It told me that my property, my specific property, 4 generations of Aldrins on this hill had been flagged in the survey's companion fauna assessment grid, which was why the survey's forward element had set down in my lower pasture, rather than continuing the overflight. I asked it what companion fauna meant. It looked at the panel, it looked at me, it looked at the farm, then it looked up the slope at the porch, where Nell's head was a dark shape in the gray morning light, still down, still on the boards, still not moved. It said, "The animal that was lying beside you when we landed." I said that was Nell. It said yes. And then it said a string of syllables in its own language. And then it said that it would be better if the rest of the cultural team came up to explain, because the explanation had some parts that were better shown than described, and it would like my permission to bring them. I said, "How many people are we talking about?" It looked at the panel. It said 9. I said, "All right, bring them up." Everybody walks around the second pasture because the ground's soft after the rain, and I didn't want anyone sinking into the low spot by the stock pond. It said it would convey that. I went back up the slope. Nell lifted her head when I got to the porch, it back on my boot the moment I sat down, and went still. 9 of them came up the slope at 6:40, and I had another pot of coffee going on the kitchen range because it seemed like it was going to be that kind of morning. They arranged themselves in the yard below the porch, steps with a kind of careful deliberateness that suggested they'd been briefed on spacing and posture, and the one who came to the front was the biggest of them, taller than the others by a head, wearing a coat of the dark color with additional markings at the shoulder. and carrying a case about the size of a large toolbox. This one introduced itself as Parath Sekev. It told me, the cultural team's companion fauna specialist. I said I was Gus Aldrin. I asked if it wanted coffee. There was a pause. Parath Sekev consulted quietly with the one beside it. Then it said, "Thank you, no." That it wasn't sure if coffee was compatible with its chemistry, but it appreciated the offer. I said, "All right. Sit down if you want. There's a bench on the porch rail end." It said it preferred to stand for the moment, and then it opened the case. Came out of the case was a tray. And on the tray were what I would describe, if I had to describe them, as 7 objects that could have been food. Could have been offerings. Arranged in a specific pattern that had the feeling of something deliberate, not random. The way you'd set a table if you'd read about table setting, but hadn't grown up doing it. Each object was a different size and texture, and what looked like a different composition. And they were spaced on the tray at intervals that increased as they went from the center outward, so the smallest one was at the center and the largest was at the rim. Parath Sekev set the tray on the bottom porch step and took 2 steps back. I looked at it. I looked at the tray. I said, "What's that for?" It said, "For the companion fauna." It said that the protocol for approaching a recognized apex companion class animal included a preliminary offering to establish non-threat status. It said the objects on the tray were calibrated to cross-species palatability modeling that the survey team's nutritional assessment had developed, Earth's canid family. And while it could not guarantee that every item on the tray would be appropriate for this specific individual, the array was designed to allow the animal to select and refuse freely, and refusal of any item would be respected and logged. I said, "You're bringing Nell a gift," it said. In the applicable terminology, yes. I looked at Nell. Nell was looking at the tray. She'd raised her head when Parath Sekev set it on the step. Her nose had come up maybe 6 inches off the boards, done its work, and then she had lowered it back to my boot and gone still. She had not stood up. She had not walked to the tray. She was not interested in the tray. Parath Sekev watched this for roughly 30 seconds. Then it looked at the panel. Then it looked at Vethavar. Then it picked up the tray, carried it back to the case, and removed a different object. This one was single, smaller, and it produced. When Parath Sekev uncovered it, a smell I couldn't place, but that made Nell's ear flick twice in quick succession. It put the new object on the step. It stepped back. Nell's ear went still. She didn't move. Parath Sekev looked at the panel. It said quietly, as though it was reporting rather than talking to me. "First-tier offering has been declined," I said. "She's not hungry. She had breakfast at 5. Parath Sekev said, "It is noted, however, the offering protocol extends beyond nutritional appeal. In the taxonomy we use for companion class apex fauna, the response to the offering communicates status. A recognized animal of significant standing will sometimes decline, regardless of palatability. Establish that it requires no provisioning," I said. "You think she's turning your gift down on purpose?" Parath Sekev said, "It is the most consistent interpretation, yes." I looked at Nell. Nell was looking at the far pasture. There was a crow on the fence post, at the edge of the property, which she had been tracking, with approximately 12% of her attention since. The crow landed there at 6:50. The other 88% of her attention appeared to be distributed across the remaining fence posts, the stock pond, the hay barn, and my boot. The 9 members of the cultural team were receiving roughly 0%. At 7:15 they attempted the second phase of the protocol. Parath Sekev explained it to me first, which I appreciated. The second phase, it said, was a territorial acknowledgement gesture, a formal recognition, delivered by a representative of the visiting party, that the companion fauna's territory was understood and respected. The gesture involved approach, a specific posture, and a brief withdrawal. It had been adapted, Parath Sekev said, from a version of the protocol used with a dozen other apex companion species across the mapped sectors of the galaxy. It had a very high success rate. I asked what success meant in this context. It said, the animal acknowledges the gesture, looks at the representative, makes some movement, stands, shifts weight, orients. Any response beyond ignoring, I said, you need her to look at you. It said, ideally, yes. Acknowledgement indicates that the companion fauna accepts the non-threat status of the visiting party. It is significant in the survey record. I said, All right, go ahead. The representative who stepped forward was a smaller member of the team, wearing the gray uniform, and it moved slowly toward the porch steps with the kind of deliberate posture that suggested training, not the stiff training of someone who didn't know what they were doing, but the deliberate, careful training of someone who had done this before and knew that was the error. It approached to about 6 feet from the bottom step. It lowered itself to something that was, more or less, crouch. It bent its limbs in a way that was biologically different from how I'd bend mine, but produced the same general impression of making itself smaller. It lowered its head. It waited. Nell watched the crow on the fence post. The representative held the posture for 40 seconds. Then it looked at Parathsekev. Parathsekev looked at the panel. The representative rose and stepped back. Parathsekev made a note, I said. She's not unfriendly. She just doesn't know you yet. Parathsekev said, the protocol indicates that a companion fauna of significant standing may decline acknowledgement of new parties as a status assertion. Refusal to orient is categorized as a mark of confidence, not a mark of aggression, I said. She's a farm dog. She works this property. You're not a sheep and you're not me, so you're not interesting to her yet. Parathsekev said, very carefully, a farm dog. I said yes. It said, what is the dog's specific function on this property, I said she moves the sheep, checks the fence, keeps the foxes out of the hen yard, wakes me up if something's wrong in the night. There was a long pause. Parathsekev spoke quietly with two members of the team in their own language. Then it turned back to me and said, she manages the territory, I said. I'd say we manage it together, but she does more of the night work. Another pause. Another consultation. The verse said something to Parathsekev that produced in Parathsekev a small physical reaction I couldn't fully read, a tightening, a kind of recalibration. Then Parathsekev said, Mr. Aldrin, with your permission, I would like to bring in an additional specialist, I said. How many more people are we talking about? It said one. A xenobiology attaché. She has been monitoring the morning's data from the ship and has requested to come up. I said, all right. I refilled my coffee. Nell adjusted her head by about an inch, found a better position on my boot, and went back to sleep. The xenobiology attaché's name, rendered in English as something close to Tessavar, and it came up the slope at a faster pace than the others, carrying a different panel and what looked like a handheld instrument of some kind. It went directly to Parathsekev and spoke for about 2 minutes without looking at me, which I didn't take personally. Then it looked at me. Then it looked at Nell. It said, Mr. Faldrin, how old is the dog? I said 7 years old. Born on this property, her mother was a working dog. 2, different owner but same type of work, it said. Has she been trained? I said, for the sheep work, yes. I trained her myself. Her mother had good instincts and Nell got them too. By the time she was 8 months old, she was working the east field without me. It said, does she range the perimeter at night? I said, every night unless the weather's bad, even then sometimes. It said, alone. I said, she doesn't need company. Tessavar looked at the instrument. It said, Mr. Aldrin, the instrumentation we've been running this morning is showing biometric data that the translation here is imperfect. The closest I can render it is. This animal is performing a continuous territorial assessment at a level of precision and coverage that our survey's companion fauna index classifies above the midpoint of the apex companion band. I said, I don't know what that means. It said, it means that what your dog is doing right now, lying on that porch, is being logged as active territorial monitoring. She has mapped everything on this property within her sensory range this morning, and she is continuing to update that map in real time. She is not sleeping. I looked at Nell. Nell's eyes were closed. I said, she looks like she's sleeping. Tessavar said, yes, she does. There was a quality to the way it said it that I hadn't heard in any of the others. Not alarm, not discomfort, something closer to a kind of careful respect. The way you speak about a thing that has been doing serious work in front of you without announcing it. I said, she does this every morning. Has since she was about 2. Tessavar said, yes, I expect she does. It went back to Parathsekev and spoke again in their language. Parathsekev's reaction this time was more visible. It straightened, did something with the panel that had the quality of urgency without being hurried. And then it looked at me and said, Mr. Aldrin, I need to contact the fleet. This will take a few minutes. I apologize for the imposition, I said. I've got to go check the east fence at some point this morning, so don't take all day, it said. Understood. They were on their communications for 20 minutes. I went inside and made toast and brought it back to the porch because it was getting to be that hour. Nell woke up, or opened her eyes, which isn't always the same thing, when she heard the bread going into the toaster, and she looked at the door until I came back out, and then she put her chin back on my boot and went still again. I ate the toast. The 9 of them stood in the yard in a loose cluster, half of them on their panels, the rest watching the porch with an attention that Nell was not reciprocating. Vethavar came up to the porch rail at one point and said, "Mr. Aldrin, may I ask you a question that is not strictly part of the protocol?" I said, "Go ahead." It said, "Have you always known what she is?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I knew she was a good dog." Vethavar said, "But not." I said, "She's a Border Collie. People have been working farms in these hills for as long as anyone in this county can remember. The breed's been doing this work for close to 200 years. Probably longer if you go back through Scotland and Wales. I didn't think she was anything unusual. She was just mine." Vethavar said, "That is," and here it paused, chose its words, "that is a very human answer, Mr. Aldrin." I said, "I take that as a compliment." It said it was meant as one. It went back to the cluster. Nell's ear flicked once in its direction as it stepped off the porch, tracked it for about 3 seconds, and then went still. She had given it more attention than she'd given any of the others combined, which I noted but didn't remark on. Parath Sekef attempted the 3rd phase of the protocol at 8:15, while we were waiting on the fleet. This one wasn't an offering and wasn't a posture. It produced from its case what looked like a length of braided cord in 2 colors, and it described this as a recognition gift. Different in category from the offering, it said, "'Cause the offering communicated non-threat status while the recognition gift communicated respect for the animal's standing." The cord, Parath Sekef said, was a marker of acknowledged rank in the companion fauna taxonomy, and nesting it was an act of formal deference from the visiting party to the resident companion fauna, I said. "You want to put that on her?" Sekef said. "With her acceptance, yes. It would be placed around her neck or collar," I said. "Nell's not going to hold still for a stranger touching her collar." Parath Sekef said, "The placement can be as attempted from a distance. The cord set at the base of the porch step for the animal to approach." I said, "Go ahead and try." Parath Sekef placed the braided cord at the bottom of the porch. Step doubled over in what looked like a careful arrangement and stepped back. Cord sat there. It was a dark green and a dark brown, braided in a pattern that looked like it might mean something in its own context. Nell opened one eye. She looked at the cord. She looked at Parath Sekef. She looked at the cord again. She moved her front paw approximately 2 inches to the left, adjusting her position on the boards, and closed her eye. Parath Sekef stood looking at her for 10 seconds. Then it made its note. It said, "Recognition gift placement, 3rd tier protocol declined. Contact refused," I said. "Do you have a category for that?" Parath Sekef said, "We are developing one this morning, Mr. Aldrin." Parath Sekef was not finished. At 8:30, it produced the 4th and final phase of the standard protocol, a formal withdrawal gesture, in which the entire team would step back to the fence line and remain there, still and visible, for a minimum of 5 minutes. The purpose, it explained, was to demonstrate to the companion fauna that the visiting party was capable of retreat, and that retreat would be their default posture. It was a protocol used most commonly with territorial animals that had shown reluctance to accept the earlier phases, the assumption being that willingness to withdraw would read in the animal's own framework. As an acknowledgement of its superior standing, I said, "You're going to stand at the fence and wait for her to notice." Parath Sekef said, "Ideally, yes. In most cases, the animal orients toward the retreating party. The orientation itself, even a brief one, is sufficient for Phase 4 completion," I said. "All right." The 9 of them walked down to the fence. They spaced themselves along it at intervals and stood still, facing the porch. Vethavar had its panel but wasn't looking at it. Tessavar had its instrument but kept it at its side. Sekef stood with its hands, or what served as hands, open at its sides, which I gathered was the posture's specific form. Nell's ear moved once, then it stopped. Her eyes stayed closed. She had not oriented toward the fence line. She had registered the movement, logged it, and returned to the fence posts and the stock pond and the east field, in that order. Parath Sakef stood at the fence for 8 minutes, 3 minutes past the protocol minimum. Then it walked back up the slope and said, particular inflection. Phase 4 complete. No orientation, I said. Does that happen often? It said. No orientation in all 4 phases is not common. It is not unprecedented, but it is unusual enough that it requires me to consult the fleet's command level guidance before proceeding, I said. What happens if you consult and they don't have guidance? It looked at the panel. It said, then we go up the chain. It took out a communication device I hadn't seen it used before. Different from the panel, more compact, with a quality to it that suggested importance in the way that certain objects suggest importance without your being able to say exactly how. And it spoke into it in its own language for about 90 seconds. Then it listened. Then it spoke for another 30. Then it put the device away and looked at me with the expression, in the specific way its face arranged itself, that I was beginning to recognize as the expression it used when something had been decided. At 8:45, Parath Sakef came back to the porch steps and told me that it had consulted with Fleet Command and that, with my permission, the fleet's Apex Recognition Officer would be coming down. I said, who's that? It said, the Apex Recognition Officer is the Survey Fleet's senior specialist in companion fauna classification. There is one per fleet. The officer's determination, specifically, the officer's direct assessment conducted in person, is the final step in the classification process. Fleet Command has determined that this situation warrants a direct assessment, I said. How many ships are in the fleet? Parath Sakef said, 37 vessels currently holding survey pattern at 300 kilometers altitude. I looked up at the sky. It was past the gray now, gone to a pale morning blue, and there was nothing visible up there. 47 ships, 300 kilometers up, holding pattern while I ate toast on my porch, and Nell monitored the fence lines. I said, how long until the officer gets here? Parath Sakef said, she is already on approach. Estimated arrival at the lower pasture, 11 minutes, I said. All right, tell her to watch the low spot by the stock pond. Ground soft after the rain. The Apex Recognition officer's name was Kethari Voss, and she arrived, not in one of the seed pod ships, but in something smaller and faster that touched down in the lower pasture without so much as disturbing the dew on the grass that the first ship had missed. She came up the slope alone, without a case and without a panel, wearing a coat that was different from everyone else's in a way that wasn't louder but quieter. Plainer cut, no markings. The dark color of someone who didn't need markings to communicate rank. She was older, I thought, than the others. In whatever way aging expressed itself in whatever she was. There was something in the ways she moved that had the same quality Nell's movement had. Not hurried, not careful, just exactly as much as the terrain required and no more. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked at Nell. She did not produce a tray. She did not crouch. She did not look at a panel. She stood there and looked at Nell for about 30 seconds, and Nell lay with her chin on my boot and did not look back. Then Kethari Voss looked at me and said, "Tst." In English that was better than any of the others. Not the careful grammar English of the learned recordings, but the English of someone who had spent real time with it. How long have you had her? I said. Since she was 8 weeks old. Her breeder's about 12 miles east of here. I drove out and picked her up in October 7 years ago in the same truck I've had for 16 years. She threw up on the passenger seat on the way home, Kethari Voss said. And before this dog. Did you have others? I said. 2 before Nell. Border Collies. My wife picked the first one. She and I've worked this farm together for 31 years. She died 4 years ago, and Nell was with her most of those last years, slept at the foot of her bed when she was sick. After that, Nell moved to the porch. Kethari Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she has been on this property her whole life. I said she has. She said, she has full run of it. I said, the whole 212 acres. She said, does she work the perimeter alone? I said I'd told the others. Every night unless the weather's bad. Kethari Voss nodded once, which was interesting because it was clearly a human gesture, one she'd picked up somewhere. She said, the survey has been above this property for 14 months. Do you know how many times her perimeter route has been flagged by our passive monitoring for? She paused, found a word. Precision? I said. I didn't know you were monitoring. She said. We monitor passively for months before any surface contact. Companion fauna assessment begins at long range. Your dog came to the attention of the assessment index at month 4 of the survey. By month 7 she has a dedicated monitoring flag, I said. A flag for what? She said the perimeter mapping. A working dog on a farm, the index expects a certain level of territorial behavior, of course. But the consistency, the coverage, the integration of new information, a coyote that moved its den, a fence post that shifted after a winter frost, the stock pond's bank changing after heavy rain. She was updating her map of this property in real time and responding to the updates at a resolution that put her in a category the index uses for. And here she paused again. And this time the pause felt like she was choosing accuracy over ease. For animals that have been doing this specific work, on this specific territory for a very long time, generationally, I said 7 years, she said 7 years of her own, but the breeds that do this work, and she tipped her head toward Nell in a way that was not quite a point. Those breeds have been doing this work for a long time. The behavior is not just trained, it is built. I looked at Nell. Nell had not moved, I said. She's just a farm dog. Cathari Voss said, yes, that is exactly what she is. She said it in a way that made it clear she meant something by it that I hadn't fully heard. She sat down then, on the bench at the porch rail end. Uninvited but without presumption. The way someone sits down when the conversation is going to take a while and standing through it would be a kind of pretense. I didn't object. I offered coffee again, and she said yes, she would try coffee, that she had heard about it. I brought out a mug. She held it the way someone holds a thing they haven't encountered before. Not nervously, just attentively. She smelled it. She took a small, careful sip. She did not say whether she liked it. She kept the mug. She said, I want to explain what happens now if that's all right. I said, go ahead, she said. The companion fauna assessment, when it reaches this stage, a direct officer assessment, not just index flagging, has a specific set of outcomes. The most common outcome is confirmation of the index flag and a species-level classification. The animal is logged in the galactic survey record as a recognized apex companion fauna of the relevant type. I said, what type? She said, territorial guardian class, which is the category for animals that manage and protect a defined territory in continuous partnership with a human, as distinct from, for instance, hunting companions, which have a different classification, or protective alerting animals, which have another. I said, she does all three. Cathari Voss looked at me. She said, yes, she does. And that is part of what makes this situation a direct assessment rather than a standard index flag. Animals that sit clearly in one category are straightforward. Animals that sit across several and do all of them at the level your dog does, those require an officer in person, I said. What do you determine? Just that she's what she is? She said, the officer determination can do a few things. It can classify the animal, can flag the territory, or it can do both, I said. What's flagging the territory mean? She said. It means the survey record notes that this property, specifically this property, is a recognized companion fauna habitat of significant standing, which affects how the property is mapped in future surveys, and how it is treated in any future contact protocols. I said, treated how? She said, carefully. With respect. No one who reads the survey record will approach this property without understanding what it is. I looked out at the lower pasture. The first ship was still there, between the second and third posts. The smaller ship Cathari Voss had come down in was near the gate. 47 more ships were up there in the blue I couldn't see them in. I said, because of Nell. She said, because of Nell, and because of the 4 generations of Aldrins who worked this farm with dogs like her. The land has that record in it. The survey picks up the long shape of things, not just the current snapshot, I said. Don't know what to do with that. She said, you don't have to do anything with it. You continue your mourning. She continues her mourning. The survey record reflects what is true. We were quiet for a while. The sun was fully up now, past the eastern ridge, and the low pasture was starting to dry. There was a Hereford cow working her way along the fence line in the upper field. One of the 3 I run on, the hill section, and Nell's eyes had opened to track it. Not moving, just watching. The cow wasn't near enough to the fence to be a concern, and Nell's body knew it. She tracked it with the same economy she tracked everything, and then the cow moved away from the fence, and Nell's eyes closed again. Cathari Voss watched this, she said. Does she sleep at all? I said. She sleeps. Just not the way you'd think. She can go from completely out to completely on in about 2 seconds. I've watched her do it since she was a pup. Something changes in the field, and she knows before she's properly awake. She said, yes. That is the part that concerned the index analysts most early on. Not the perimeter mapping. The response latency. The gap between stimulus and response in a territorial guardian animal is one of the primary metrics in the classification index. She paused. Short, I said. How short, she said. In the index, animals are classified by response latency on a descending scale. Most companion animals your survey would log. Affectionate, bonded, loyal animals, genuinely good animals, operate in the mid-range of that scale. Response in 2 to 3 seconds to an unexpected territorial stimulus. Your dog operates at a level the index labels the apex band. That is not a common label, I said. How many dogs get it? She said. In this sector of the survey 3, your dog is one of them, I said. What are the others? She said. A Belgian Malinois currently attached to a security detail on the orbital station above this planet's moon, and a retired working dog of, she checked an internal memory, the breed called Anatolian Shepherd, living on a farm in the landmass your maps label Turkey, I said. I know the Malinois type. Good dogs, hard workers, she said. Yes, they are all good dogs. She said it with something in it I couldn't quite name. Respect is too simple a word. It was more like the acknowledgement you give to something that has been doing important work without any recognition of the fact. The acknowledgement of a debt that nobody got around to recording, I said. How many species are in the apex companion band overall? She set her mug on the rail and thought about it. She said, across the surveyed sectors. And the survey covers a considerable area, 11 species. Across 8 worlds, your planet contributes 3 of those 11, I said. Which 3? She said the domestic dog, in several of its working subtypes. The domestic cat, in its independent territory managing expression, and one other, more rarely, in specific working contexts. She paused and said, the horse. I looked at the barn. I don't run horses anymore, Eleanor was the rider, and after she passed, I sold the 2 mares, which was a practical decision, and one I've been second-guessing since. There was still the smell of horses in the old barn if you went in on a warm afternoon. And I went in sometimes, I said. We had horses for 30 years on this farm. Cathari Voss looked at the barn, she said. I know, that record is in the survey too. The barn still reads as an active habitat in the index, not currently occupied, but not decommissioned. The survey flags the absence of an occupant as an open file, not a closed one. I didn't say anything to that for a moment. Then I said, that's an interesting way to look at it, she said. The survey takes a long view. At 9:30, Cathari Voss stood and said she was ready to make her determination. She set her coffee mug on the porch rail. It was empty, I noticed. She'd finished it, and she stepped to the edge of the porch and looked at Nell for a long moment. Nell had her eyes open. She was watching the crow, had come back to the fence post. She didn't look at Cathari Voss. Cathari Voss said, addressing Nell directly and without any apparent self-consciousness about it. I am logging this property as a companion fauna habitat, Class 1, Territorial Guardian Continuous Occupancy of Record. The animal present is recognized as apex companion fauna of the Territorial Guardian class, confirmed by direct officer assessment, Cathari Voss, Apex Recognition Unit, Galactic Survey Fleet Designation 7. Nell watched the crow. Cathari Voss said. The fleet's survey grid will be adjusted to reflect the habitat designation. Future contact protocols for this property will require advance notice and cultural liaison clearance. The designation is permanent and transferable with the land. Then she turned to me and said, in a quieter register, Mr. Aldrin, the determination is logged. I will give you a copy in a format you can read. I will have Vethavar prepare it before we leave. It will explain the designation and what it means in practical terms for any future contact with survey entities. I said, I appreciate that, she said. The copy will also note the 4-generation occupancy record. It is part of the habitat designation. The land's history is part of what it is. I thought about that. I thought about my father working this pasture, and his father before him, and the dogs each of them had had. Not always border collies, not always the same breed, but always working dogs, always on this ground, always at the end of somebody's boot in the morning. I said, my wife would have liked knowing this. Cathari Voss said, what was her name? I said, Eleanor. She went by Nell too, actually. That's where the dog's name came from. Cathari Voss was quiet for a moment, then she said, the habitat record will include her name if you wish. I said, I'd like that. The cultural team came back up the slope at 10 for what Parath Sekev called the closing protocols. Turned out to involve substantially less ceremony than the opening protocols had. Parath Sekev stood at the porch steps and read a brief formal statement in its own language, and then in English. Something about mutual recognition, something about non-interference, something about the survey record being sealed and available to any party with authorized access. Vethavar handed me a flat card about the size of a business card but considerably heavier, and said that this was the notation document, and that it would display the determination record when held to light, and that I should keep it with my property records. Put it in my shirt pocket. I said, what do I do if someone else shows up, and I need to show them? Vethavar said, the card is coded to the property coordinates. Any vessel with survey-level instrumentation will recognize it. I said, what if they don't have survey instrumentation? Vethavar said, if they do not have survey instrumentation, they likely do not have the technology to reach you. But if they do reach you, card will still serve as a record of the determination in any context where it is presented. I said, fair enough. Parath Sekev attempted, one final time, to present a formal offering to Nell. It said a small object, something smooth and dark, the size of a walnut, on the bottom porch step, took 2 steps back and stood waiting. Nell opened one eye. She looked at the object. She looked at Parath Sekev. She closed her eye. Parath Sekev made a note. It said declined, second tier, direct presentation, log. And then, a pause. She is consistent, I said. She's a border collie. Parath Sekev said yes. We understand that now. It collected the cord and the tray, and everything else from the case, and closed it up with the careful efficiency of something that was done with a job and knew it. Then it looked at me and said, Mr. Aldrin, in my experience with companion fauna assessments, and I have conducted 41 of them across 7 worlds, the animal's response to the offering protocols is the clearest signal we have. An animal that accepts one of the offerings we classify. An animal that examines the offerings and selects, we classify at a higher level. An animal that declines all offerings without interest, that has not needed to establish non-threat status, because non-threat status was never in question. We log as a different kind of case, I said. What kind of case? It said, the kind where the visiting party is the one establishing its status, not the resident animal. She was not evaluating whether to accept our offerings. She was deciding whether we were worth acknowledging at all, I said. And the verdict. Parath Sekev looked at Nell. Nell had her eyes closed. It said, the verdict appears to be, not yet. They left in the order they'd arrived, the 9 of the cultural team first. Back, down the slope, and through the gate I'd unlocked. Back to the seed pod ship that lifted out of the south pasture at 10:22 and climbed, without sound, into the morning sky. Then Vethavar, who shook my hand at the gate with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been briefed on, handshaking and had practiced it. Then Parath Sekev, who did not shake my hand but inclined its head at me in a way that had the quality of a real gesture, not a learned one. Savar, the xenobiology attaché, paused at the gate and said, Mr. Aldrin, I want to say, and it looked at the porch, where Nell was already back in her place, chin on the boards watching the field. I want to say that in 4 years of companion fauna survey work, I have not seen a direct officer assessment called before noon on the same morning as first contact. Usually it takes weeks. The index flags the animal. The flag is reviewed. The review is assessed. The assessment is forwarded. The officer schedules a visit. This morning, from the time we landed to the time Officer Cathari Voss made her determination, was just over 4 hours, I said. What made it fast? Tessavar said. The offering refusals. The first one, Officer Cathari Voss was watching the feed from the ship when Nell declined the first-tier offering. She boarded within 8 minutes. She told me afterward that she'd never seen a first-tier offering declined with that level of, and here Tessavar, Paused. She used the word for it in our language that I will translate as equanimity. She said she needed to see it in person, I said. Nell just wasn't hungry. Tessivar said yes, and that, Mr. Aldrin, is exactly the point. It went down through the gate, I locked it behind it. Kethari Voss was last. She came up to the porch one more time before she went, and she said, "There are 43 other properties in this continent's region that the survey flagged for companion fauna assessment. They will be contacted over the next several weeks by cultural Slazen teams. I thought you should know that. Some of those properties are likely known to you. Farms and working operations in your county and the counties nearby." I said. "I'll keep it to myself if you'd rather," she said. "I'd rather you didn't, actually. It will go more smoothly if the people being contacted have some advanced sense of what to expect. You could tell them," and she paused, finding the right shape for it, "that it's a census, that the survey wants to count the working dogs," I said. "I can do that," she said. "Thank you." She went down the slope. At the gate she stopped and looked back at the porch. At Nell, I thought, not at me. And then she went through the gate and down to her ship, and the ship lifted quietly out of the lower pasture and was gone before I finished watching it go. I sat on the porch for a while after. The sun was up, and the field was dry, and the Herefords were moving in the upper pasture the way they do when the morning is warming, slow, unhurried, following their own logic. The crow was gone from the fence post. The lower pasture showed two sets of landing impressions in the grass, one larger and one smaller, already starting to spring back. Nell had not moved. She was on the boards, chin down, eyes at half-mast, doing the slow continuous cataloging she always did. The fence posts, stock pond, the hay barn, the east field, the chickens in the pen. She was running the numbers on all of it the same way she ran them every way she'd run them last Tuesday, and the Tuesday before that, and every morning of the 7 years she'd been mine. And the morning before that when she'd been 8 weeks old, in a cardboard box in my truck, throwing up on the seat. Took the card out of my shirt pocket and held it to the light. It lit up from inside, a pale luminescence, soft, and in the light I could see the notation record. Symbols I couldn't read, and below them, in careful English block letters, Companion Fauna Habitat Designation, Class 1, Territorial Guardian, and below that, in smaller letters, the coordinates of the farm. And below that, 2 names, Nell Eleanor. I looked at it for a while. Then I put it back in my pocket and went in to see about lunch. The calls had started that afternoon. Jim Tarkle, 3 farms east, called at about 2 o'clock to say that something had landed in his back 40. And was it anything to worry about? I told him it was a census. Census of what, he said. Working dogs, I told him. There was a pause, he said. They drove out all this way for that. I said. Something like that, he said. Well, that's the government for you. I said it wasn't exactly the government. He said, federal or no? I said, more like further than that. Another pause. He said, like international? I said, further than that, Jim. There was a longer pause. Then he said, they going to want to talk to Chester? Chester was his Australian shepherd. 8 years old, arthritis in one hip, still worked the morning fence check every day without being asked. Had a spot on the kitchen rug where he slept between rounds, and Jim's wife had put a piece of carpet foam under it because of the hip. And Chester had rearranged the foam 3 times before Jim pointed out that Chester probably knew better than they did where he wanted it. I said, that's my guess, Jim said. Well, he's going to need about 20 minutes notice because he sleeps late now. Since the hip, I said, I'll let them know. Linda Marsh was next. From the Crooked S 12 miles north, calling at 3:15 to say that a thing like a silver seed had been sitting in her South Hayfield since mid-morning, and did I know anything about it? I told her what I'd told Jim, she said. And they came to you first, I said. They came here first, yes, she said. Because of Nell, I said, because of Nell. There was a silence that had something comfortable in it, the way silences between people who have known each other for 30 years sometimes do. Then Linda said, my father always said that dog had something extra. I said, which dog, she said. Whichever one you had, all of them. He said, Nell's grandmother had it, and Nell's mother had it, and you were going to see it in Nell too. He said a dog like that could hold a 40-acre hillside in her head like a map. I said he was right, Linda said. He'd have liked knowing somebody finally agreed with him. I said, somebody didn't. Writing, even, she laughed. She said she'd go down and open the gate for them. And could she tell them to watch out for the soft spot by her creek? Because the bank had given way in March and she hadn't gotten it shored up yet. I said, tell them that first thing. They appreciate it. I called 6 more farms that evening. The conversations all went roughly the same. Confusion, a pause, a question about whether their dog was going to need to do anything, and when I said no, the dog just needed to be itself. Something in each voice settled. People in this county have been trusting their dogs to be themselves for as long as there have been dogs and farms here. The idea that being themselves was enough, that it was, in fact, the whole point, landed without much difficulty once I explained it that way. Muriel Doss, who runs the Rafter about 6 miles south, said, Bo's not going to like strangers, I said. That's all right. They're expecting that, she said. He's going to lie in the yard and not look at them, I said. That might actually be what they're hoping for, she said. Well, he'll deliver on that, I can promise you. Ray Folsom, over at the Folsom operation near the county line, said he had 2 dogs and wanted to know if they'd both be assessed, or just one. I said I didn't know for certain, but my best guess was they'd be interested in both. He said, Sadie or Duke. I said, what are they? He said, Sadie's a Border Collie. Duke's a Catahoula mixed with some unknown contribution that we've been debating for 9 years, I said. They'll want to see both, he said. Duke's going to eat their tray, I said. Then Duke's going to eat their tray. There was a long pause, and then Ray said, in a different tone of voice, Is this actually what I think it is? I said. I think so. He was quiet for a bit. Then he said, all right, I'll have them both on the porch. The second ship came to the Tarkle farm the next morning. Jim called at 9 to tell me Chester had ignored the offering tray so completely that, the cultural liaison officer had actually picked the tray up and moved it closer to where Chester was lying, and Chester had relocated 3 feet to the left and lain back down. I said, what did they do? He said. They wrote it down. He sounded pleased about it. Not surprised. He'd known Chester long enough not to be surprised. But pleased, in the way you're pleased when something you already knew turns out to be right. I said. That's good, he said. They want to come back Thursday and bring a bigger team, I said. Tell them to watch the soft ground by your back pond, he said. Already did. By the end of that first week, 4 farms in the county had been visited. Sadie Folsom had been classified, Apex Companion Band, Territorial Guardian class, same as Nell, and Duke Folsom had eaten one object off the offering tray, turned it from wherever dogs return things they've chewed, and then lain on top of the tray. The cultural team had filed a note about Duke that Ray told me about, and the note apparently used a term that translated roughly as enthusiastic. Engagement, which Ray said was the most accurate description of Duke he'd ever heard from any source. Bo Doss had ignored the entire cultural team with a consistency that apparently set a record for duration of non-acknowledgement in the team's companion fauna database. Marielle told me they'd waited an hour and 40 minutes before logging the result. She said, Bo had spent the whole time watching the cattle in the upper paddock and had looked at the cultural team exactly once, approximately 2 seconds, in the way he looked at things that were neither sheep nor her. She said the specialist had described this as, quote, the most complete territorial priority response I have observed in a non-trained subject, she said. He's not trained. He just doesn't care about things that aren't his business, I said. That's what they wrote down. It was 3 weeks before the cultural teams had worked through most of the county. Nell was referenced in 7 of the subsequent assessments. I was told later, not directly assessed again, but cited as the comparative standard for the regional index. Prethsikev sent Vethavar back to the farm twice more in that time, once with a clarifying question about Nell's night range perimeter, and once with an additional copy of the designation card, which I gave to my daughter when she visited that weekend, because the farm will be hers someday and she should have the records. She held the card to the light and read it for a long time. Then she looked at Nell, who was lying in the yard below the porch, tracking the movement of 3 lambs in the near paddock with the patience of someone who has been watching lambs in paddocks for 7 years and will watch lambs in paddocks for 7 years more. My daughter said, she's just Nell, I said, that's the thing about it. She turned the card over in her hands. She said, what does Class 1 mean? I said, it means the property is protected in their survey record. Any future contact has to go through a liaison process first. It's like a right-of-way, except it works in the other direction. They have to ask permission, she said. And Nell did that, I said. Nell being Nell did that. My daughter looked at the dog for a long moment. Nell was doing what she always did, running the fence lines with her eyes, cataloging the lambs against her mental roster of where each one was supposed to be, updating the map. The middle lamb had moved 8 feet closer to the fence than it had been 2 minutes ago. Nell's head shifted by about 1 degree to track it. The lamb decided the fence wasn't interesting and moved back. Nell's head returned to center. She said, "She was doing this the whole time they were here, wasn't she?" I said. "The whole time." She sat with me on the porch for an hour that evening. We didn't talk much. Nell moved once, crossing the yard to check the lambs more closely, and then came back and lay at the foot of the porch steps and put her nose on her paws. 47 vessels had mapped this farm. 3 months of passive survey from 300 kilometers up. A direct assessment by the fleet's senior officer. A designation that would stay on the survey record for as long as anyone kept records. 2 names on the card: Nell, Eleanor, permanent, transferable with the land. Anyone who came after, in whatever ship from whatever distance, would read those names before they opened any gates. Nell had not once lifted her head. She didn't need to. She had work to do. And the farm was as it should be, and the morning was coming again, and she would be on the porch at first light the way she always was, running the numbers on the fence posts, and the stock pond, and the east field, and the lambs and the chickens in the pen, the way her mother's people had been running numbers on fields like this for 200 years and more. That was enough. It had always been enough. She was just a farm dog. That was exactly what she was.